observe, but you can see the image of the king depicted here. This is King Agrippa I. And on the left is a reconstruction that the Israel Museum authorities put together to provide a 3D picture portrayal of what Herod Agrippa would have looked like. This is out of the one of the museums in Jerusalem, and looked like somebody that you might meet on the street somewhere. I mean, these people were people just like you and I are. But one of the questions that arises is, where did he imprison Peter? Was it in Antonia Fortress, which was a fortress on the northwest corner of the temple area? There were garrisons of soldiers that were kept there. Or was it in the Praetorium, the old Herod the Great's palace? Of course, Herod the Great's no longer around. And when the administrators would come to Jerusalem, they would tend to stay within Herod's palace in Jerusalem. And here's a photograph of a model of what that palace may have looked like on the basis of a lot of the evidence that we have available. But it also had a fortress characteristic to it. Was it in this fortress that Peter is kept? We don't know. But regardless, Peter is released. But he's guarded here with 4 squadrons of soldiers, probably implying Roman soldiers. So this likely puts it either in the Antonia Fortress or in Herod's palace. But these 4 squadrons consisted usually of 4 soldiers each who would rotate their watch, shifting responsibilities between 4 3-hour watches. So the day would be divided up in 12 hours, and then there would be 4 3-hour watches, and then they would rotate accordingly. This often would be governed by the use of a water clock. And here's a photograph of a water clock that is in the museum in Athens at the Agora. And here is a photograph of a water clock that was used in Egypt. And what happens is they would fill this up with water and it would be gauged. And the water then would flow out. And when the water gets to the bottom, that's the end of the time allotted. So this would allow them, without the sunlight, to determine the duration of activities. But as we think in terms of Herod Agrippa himself, one of the things we have to remember is he had the audacity, the stupidity, if you want to call it that, to initiate executions against the leadership of the Lord's church. Secondly, as a Jew, he defied the Lord's commands not to produce a graven image. This is one of the tenets of the 10 Commandments. But he made coins with his own image on them. And you can imagine how frustrated the Jewish people would be with this bravado on his part to present himself. And of course, the Christians then become objects of some of that bravado.
Really good historical context. We're going to look a little bit, unpeel a little bit more of that Dr. Manor talks about there in Acts chapter 12. And some interesting dynamics that's going on as we've been studying. The outline talks about political expedience, and unimagined results. He characterized the aspect of the Herods, and we're going to look at that a little bit more because the Herod dynasty plays a large role in New Testament times, and we'll look at that some more. Remember, hey, it's not advancing, Ryan. There you go. Thank you. Now, at this time, this is where we ended last week. Remember, here's a historical context as well. Now, at this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem at Antioch. Remember, Barnabas and Saul are in Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And Josephus writes that this probably occurred during 45 to 47 AD. Josephus, the historian, writes about this famine that Luke refers to in his writing. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. So this is where we left off last week. So when we come to chapter 12, now about that time, so this is kind of in the same time, probably before the famine starts. We know Claudius is the ruler, the emperor who's ruling during that time. So it's during this time frame that Luke's going to take us into some of the next things that's going to happen to the church, particularly to the apostles. I want to look at these 2 verses first, as Dr. Manor's already read to us. Now, about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. Now, the language indicates that there may have been others who were arrested, but particularly James is the focus and Peter is the focus. A lot of scholars say there may have been others that were arrested, but these two, obviously, these two figures are center because they're apostles. They're ones that are leading the efforts of the church. So we know that that's the case. Now, this is interesting. This is the fourth persecution we've seen against the church in Acts up to this point. But here's a difference. Up to this point, we've seen a Jewish body who has instigated the persecution, which would have been who? The Sanhedrin. So a Jewish body has instigated the persecution of the church. But now we have a Roman official. Now it's becoming a Roman issue. So now we're going to see a Roman official, basically Herod's appointed by Rome to serve, and we'll peel back his dynasty a little bit. But we see the first time a Roman official is going to be involved in persecution. And it ratchets up a little bit, doesn't it? Because what occurs? He's going to put James to death. He's going to be beheaded by a sword. His beheading, if he was killed by Jews, he would probably have been stoned like Stephen was. That was kind of a mob rule from the Sanhedrin, the group of Jews that we saw stone Stephen. But this is going to be more of an official killing by a Roman official, a designated Roman official. So we're going to see some difference in that. Herod basically became a title as much as a name. So that's where it gets confusing with us in Scripture. When we read Herod, a lot of times it's referring to a title more than an individual, because several of Herod's sons are referred to as Herod. And we're going to see here in the book of Acts, I think it's helpful for us to see the different people it's talking to, are talking about, which can help us in the understanding and also give us some indication of this dynasty family and how they were run by political expediency, and they would do anything they could to hold power. And they were a very power-hungry dynasty, and then we'll look at that a little bit. But we're seeing a difference here in what occurs. So also, remember, there was a time where the church had relatively peacefulness. Remember, even in Acts 2:47, they had favor with all the people. But we see that tendency to change at the preaching of Stephen, because he stirs up the people. If we remember our account of Stephen's persecution, he stirs up the people in what he's teaching about the Christ, and the Jews get stirred up on Stephen. And it seems like that's when we see the persecution from Saul start in Acts chapter 8. Persecution ramps up, but then there becomes a period of peacefulness, and we see that defined in Acts 9:31. After the conversion of Saul, in later part of chapter 9, we have this passage. So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria enjoyed peace, being built up and going on in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit. It continued to increase. But then we see a turn. We're going to see that turn, and Herod is going to be a leader in some of that persecution that's going to rage itself again. A lot of people think that period of peacefulness occurred after the conversion of Saul. Why you might think that might have happened after Saul's conversion, that there was a period of peace, the persecution against the church settled down for a period of time. Why do you think that might be?
Because the persecutor was converted.
Yeah, persecutor was converted. He was the lead man going out and leading the persecution. He was sent out by the Sanhedrin to go and arrest these Christians. Well, when he is converted and he stops that process, it's a period of time before they're really organized enough to get involved in that again, or until it ramps up again. So we see there seems to be a period of peace within the church, but we know that Satan's not going to allow that to last very long. And so we're going to see that at the hand of leaders. Any comments or thoughts about that? Yeah, John.
Herod likes the name Caesar. an office.
Yeah, Herod kind of becomes like the name Caesar as kind of an office or a title. Probably a good way to describe it, John. Yeah, you have the Caesars all referred to as Caesar. They're not all Julius Caesar. It became a title. Herod kind of becomes a title. We're going to look at that. I just want to share this with you because it's kind of interesting. You can see from their lineage, and like Dr. Manor said, it's just so convoluted, but you can see from their lineage just how convoluted it is. And how corrupt this family could be. Herod the Great's the one we remember, but I want to show this to you because the Herods that are mentioned in the Bible, these are different Herods that are mentioned and kind of have a context of that. And it just helps as we read. And with Luke's historical background, when he refers to the Herods, we want to know, and he'll give us some reference to that. Herod the Great that we remember most for doing what? Killing the babies. He's the one who killed the babies. He's the one, the great builder. Herod was a great builder. And Herod basically was allowed to rule over all Judea at the time of his reign. And he reigned for about 37 years. He began the temple construction in 19 BC is when the new temple began, 19 BC. It wasn't completed until 63 AD. So it wasn't completed till we know that Jesus and them see the temple and question it because it's under construction during Jesus' day still. And so it gets finished in AD 63, and when's it destroyed? AD 70. So it's only completed for 7 years before it's going to be destroyed. But Herod was a builder. He built palaces. We're going to talk about the palace. He had a palace in Jerusalem. Remember the Herods, they lived in Caesarea, which is the home of the Roman rulers. We talked about that in this region, but they had a home in Jerusalem. They would come to Jerusalem for a feast day. So Luke is going to talk to us about the timing on that too in a passage, because what we're going to see happen, it's on the Passover during the feast day, a week-long Passover religious feast. So that's why Herod is going to be in Jerusalem because of the feast. So that's where they would come back. But if you look at Herod the Great's the one who's talked about in Luke 1 and 2 and Matthew 2. He killed the babies. We see a reference of his death early on in Matthew 2:19. The reference is that Herod has died. When Herod dies, Archelaus is his son, takes over, and Mary and Joseph heard that he took over, so they didn't come back home because he was in charge. So he's referred to as the new Herod. His name is actually referenced here in Matthew 2:22. Herod Antipas, we recognize as he's the one who do you most recognize him as? The killer of John the Baptist. Okay. This is the Herod. It's not Herod the Great that didn't kill John the Baptist. It's his son, Herod Antipas. Now, these are 4 sons of Herod. Herod had more sons, but these are 4 that we're going to deal with. He actually has this one put to death we're going to talk about for a second. But Herod Antipas is the Herod who puts John the Baptist to death. Now, this is where it gets convoluted. Okay, Herod is persecuted by John, or preached to by John the Baptist because he marries Herodias, okay, which used to be his brother's wife, okay? So he marries her, and it's actually his brother's daughter. So go figure all that out. This happens a lot in this family. So that's where the lines are drawn. She is Aristobulus' daughter, and she marries Philip. Then she's going to marry Herod, and you can see why John the Baptist preaches about this is just wrong. This is just wrong. So when we read in Matthew 14, this is what Matthew's writing about John the Baptist. So that's that connection there, okay? Let's see, another connection is, so the Herod in Acts we're going to look at, Herod Agrippa the first. So he's referred to as Herod, but he is Herod Agrippa the first. He is the son of Aristobulus, so that makes him the grandson of Herod the Great. So he's the grandson of Herod the Great, okay? His father is killed by Herod the Great. He kills his own son because he's jealous. He's always worried about power. He thinks there's a threat here. He has his son killed. Herod is about 4 years old. The story says that he's about 4 years old. So his mother, his grandmother, Herod's wife, Mariamne, who was actually a Jew, that's the only connection. Herod has with Jews is that he marries a Jew, one of his wives. He has other wives, but he marries a Jew. But actually, Herod was is a descendant of Esau. He was an Edomite, but he marries a Jew. So she sends Herod Agrippa to Rome when he's 4 years old. Let him be raised there in Rome in the palace. That's where he comes in contact with Claudius, and he gets to know Caligula. They're both going to be Roman emperors. So the door is going to open for why Agrippa is going to become such a powerful king, because of these acquaintances he has as he's growing up. He's going to actually be known by two emperors, Claudius and Caligula. Look at that. So with that being said, so you get an idea of who he is, the Herod we're going to talk about here. Now, there's two references in Acts, and this gets confusing too. Acts 4:27 and Acts 13:1 is referring to Herod Antipas. So when you read that context, it's referring to past history. And that reference is made to past history because they'll mention Pontius Pilate in that passage, particularly in Acts 4:7. They mention Pontius Pilate and Herod. So that would be Herod Antipas. So, but the other passages that refer to Herod in Acts will be Herod Agrippa. We're going to see he actually is going to die here in chapter 12. We'll see that. So when you go further into Acts, here's why this family is important. As we go further into Acts, to keep from being confused, if I hadn't confused you enough already, it's a confusing family. Herod Agrippa, okay, the first, he has 4 children, I think, but actually 3 children is what we deal with in the book of Acts. So he has 3 children. Herod Agrippa II, we're going to see come on the scene in Acts 25:26. King Agrippa, the Acts refers to him as King Agrippa. He's not referred to as Herod, but King Agrippa is actually a Herod. We're going to see him in Acts 25:26. Okay, his wife is Bernice, which is his sister. So I'm just telling you the facts. His wife is his sister. We see them in Acts 25:26. And then Drusilla, which is another daughter of Herod Agrippa, she's going to be married to Governor Felix, which we're going to see Governor Felix in Acts 24 when Paul goes before them. Remember, Agrippa's even going to say, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Remember that statement. So Paul's going to get to give his conversion experience and his teaching. He's going to get to teach before these powerful people. And he's going to preach before this powerful family. And, with the boldness of John. So anyway, I just find it interesting to have the background there. So when you read about Herod, don't get confused about the time period how this Herod, you can see how it's just used that way in that regard. I think that's the main things I wanted to bring out. Yes, ma'am, Karen. No. I think she was a full sister. Now, that's a good question here. Now, some of these were half brothers. So, but yeah, I think she was I think they were all from the same mother. Now, I might not be totally sure of that because there's a lot of marriages going on, but it seemed like they may be from the same mother, but these weren't all, and that's typically probably the way it would be. Now, interesting about Herod the Great, told you that when Herod Agrippa's father was killed by his father, Herod was married to Mariamne, and she saves her grandson, sends him to Rome, but she is eventually killed by Herod, and she actually comes from the Maccabean dynasty. Remember the Maccabees in the intertestamental history from the Old Testament and the New Testament, when Syria took over and almost destroyed the Jews and the temple and everything during that time, the Maccabean family steps up and are the heroes during that time to restore it. The Maccabean family was a family of priests. Well, he gets jealous because of her family heritage, and he actually tries to eliminate all the Maccabeans so they can't take over his rule. He eventually has her killed. And it's interesting, scholars write that she's probably the only wife he had that he really loved. And he kills her. That's convoluted love, isn't it? But power Power was what it was all about. So this is the kind of people we're dealing with. So when Herod, we're going to see now when Herod arrests James and Peter, there's a political expediency for what they're going to do. Let me share one passage with you from history to show you what a historian Luke is. And we see that carry over into Acts. Of course, Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke. He writes Acts. And so here in Luke 3, he's going to give us some of the history of some of these brothers we're talking about, some of Herod's sons. It says, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, that's Herod Antipas, and his brother Philip, remember those three of those brothers I showed you, his brother Philip was tetrarch and region of Iturea and Trachonitis. Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene, and in the high priesthood of Annas, Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias in the wilderness. Now, tetrarch means a fourth. It's a ruler of fourth. So when Herod the Great died, he had control of all Palestine. Well, the new emperor is divided into fourths. So they split it among some of Herod's sons. So tetrarch has the idea of fourth. So he's telling us who ruled what region. And so Luke is very much a historian. And it's just another proof of the accuracy and the inspiration of the Bible, that the history is true. There's history there that's confirmed, it's true, and it's a book that's inspired by God. So when you talk about regions, Samaria, Judea, we see that one of his brothers was one of the sons of Herod the Great was tetrarch of Judea, Idumea, up here at Trachonius, and we see the different areas that they would be assigned a fourth of what Herod would have ruled at one time. Yeah, Mike? Actually, that was said about Herod. Actually, it was said about Herod Antipas, his son. That's who that was said about, I believe. Bill? There's no record of that. The closest we get is Agrippa, who tells Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And we'll unpack that more when we get into chapters 25 and 26 of that dynamic. So it's going to be interesting as we see this history unfold in the book of Acts. We're going to see Paul stand before these people and preach to them, but we don't see a response. That's the closest response we see, Bill, in Scripture. So we really don't know. History doesn't really tell us that I'm aware of. If somebody else knows some other side of that, but don't know anything other from history. Yes, sir. Yeah. And Mike, back to your point, Herod Antipas is who Jesus stood in front of. That's who Pilate sends Jesus to. Herod Antipas, who had put John the Baptist to death. Okay, so that's who they say is a sly fox. That's who they're referring to there. One of the sons of Herod. Jerry? No ignorant questions, Jerry.
Are they Roman officials?
They're appointed by Rome, yeah.
Okay.
They are allowed to serve at the pleasure of Rome. And so that's why so many of these, I showed you the tetrarchs, they don't stay in power very long. And that's how Herod Agrippa gets his power, because the others are cast out. And so they decide who else is going to rule now. And because, we're going to see that because Herod, actually, Caligula gets killed, Claudius takes over as an emperor, and so he's deciding who am I going to let rule, and he allows Agrippa, because of their association, he's going to allow Agrippa, he's not going to have tetrarchs anymore with fourth. Agrippa's going to have the whole thing. That's why he's referred to, Dr. Manor said he's referred to as king, because he actually is over all Palestine now. He has control of all of it. So some have said that, and I'll read this, I don't want to misquote it. I'll read the quote here in a minute about his the power that he had. Here it is. He controlled more territory. This is one commentator writing it. This is about Herod that we're talking about, Herod Agrippa, who's the one who's going to have James killed. He controlled more territory than any Jewish monarch since Solomon. Claudius gave him control of all of it. So that's pretty powerful aspect. So that's how powerful this Herod had become, the grandson of Herod the Great. And he's only king for 3 years, and we're going to see his demise here at the end of chapter 12. Other thoughts or comments? I know that's a lot, and probably I gave you too much because I love that history, but hopefully get it context. Just this is a powerful family, but there is a lot of there's a lot of issues, and it's all about power. You do your marriages for power, what's more expedient for you, and who you can trust. And it's just you read about these families. Josephus writes extensively about the Herods, and it's just, oh my goodness, it's just a soap opera when you read through it, as you can imagine. Bill? Yeah. Wars for power for a lot of the same reasons, aren't they? Yeah. But I really like the context of the history here because this is who we're going to be dealing with moving forward in Acts. We see the first outbreak of a Roman official, a Roman appointed official that's going to get involved in the persecution of God's people, and particularly the apostles. Now, so he's going to, and it tells us then in verse 1 that he puts James to death. Now, the James that we're talking about, remember in Matthew 20 through 23, it's interesting, people write about why did James die? I mean, we can't answer those questions. Why wasn't he freed? We're going to see what happens to Peter. It's different what happens to James. Peter's freed. Peter's going to be freed, which we'll study about next week. James is going to get killed. He's going to get beheaded. And you remember in Matthew 20, 22, 23, Matthew's account says that the mothers of James and John, the mothers of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come to Jesus. Mark tells us in Mark 10, their account, obviously the sons are with him. So whether the mother asked this of Jesus, the sons are involved in asking this of Jesus. So I get the impression they're all there present and they're asking Jesus this question. The mother of sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down and making a request of him. And he said to her, "What do you wish?" And she said to him, "Command that in your kingdom these two sons of mine may sit one on your right and one on your left hand." What kind of kingdom is she thinking about? A physical kingdom. They had given up this fishing business they'd had with their dad. Remember, they came from probably a wealthy family. They were known by the high priest. Remember, John's recognized in the courtyard by the high priest and servants, so that he was recognized. So they probably came from more of a wealthy family than some of the other apostles. So can they have a right and a left hand on your kingdom? And her mindset going, they've given up a lot for you. You can only imagine what her thoughts might be as a mother. But Jesus answered, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink?" And they said to him, "We are able." And he said to them, "My cup you shall drink, but to sit at my right and on my left, that is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." What cup was it Jesus said they were going to drink?
Death.
A cup of suffering. Death, wasn't it? You will drink out of the same cup I'm going to drink out of. They had no idea what they were asking, did they? And so we see it fulfilled here. Jesus said, "You will drink out of this cup." And so we see the first aspect of this with James giving his life for the cause of Christ. There's an interesting note there as we look at that. This is not the author. James that's killed here is not the author of James, the book of James. It's a different James. James, who wrote the book of James, is actually the brother of Jesus. He was not an apostle. So this is the apostle James. So a lot of people get that confused. It's not the writer of the book of James. So we see that, and the idea killed with a sword gives the indication of decapitation, and it's really everything that Herod could have hoped for. We see that in verses 3 through 4. This gives him great pleasure because it says, when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now, here's the other history that Luke's given us. Now, it was during the days of the unleavened bread, the week of the Passover week. So it's a week-long Jewish festival. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, and tending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So that first verse 3, what indication does it give you for the whole purpose of him putting James to death? I'm sorry? Popularity with the Jews, wasn't it, Nancy? Yeah. He saw it was pleasing to the Jews. And so he proceeded to arrest Peter. So it gives us some indication that maybe they weren't arrested at the same time. Do you get that indication? Yeah, it seems like that. Maybe James was maybe arrested with some others, but it appears to be that when he saw that it pleased them and he put James to death, then he proceeds to arrest Peter. Now, some have said some of the apostles were spread out and not in Jerusalem at the time, that maybe only James and Peter were only the apostles have been spread out, and they come back to Jerusalem. As they go out teaching, they come back to Jerusalem. So we're not sure how that might occur, but after seeing how great it pleased the people when he killed James, he arrests Peter to put him to death. During the days of the unleavened bread, so it's a feast day. So we know what their opinion was during the feast. We see this same attitude during the feast when they were scheming to arrest Jesus. Remember in Mark 14, 1-2, now the Passover and unleavened bread were 2 days away. The chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to seize him by stealth and kill him, for they were saying, not during the feast, otherwise there might be a riot of the people. So he says he's going to wait till after the feast, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. He could do it not during the feast days, but he's still going to have what? He's still going to have a crowd of people in Jerusalem. He's still going to be able to show his popularity, ain't he, Nancy? Because he's playing to the crowds. He knows during the feast time, we're going to have all these crowds in Jerusalem. That's why he's in Jerusalem from Caesarea. He's come from Caesarea, the palace. He lives in his father's palace in Caesarea, or his grandfather's palace, and he's come to Jerusalem for the feast and stayed in his grandfather's palace in Jerusalem. They have a palace in Jerusalem, and he's there for the feast because all the people are there. And so, obviously, he's going to play to the crowd. So after the feast is over, is his intention, well, what do you think his intention is? What do you think his intention is with Peter? Yeah, would there be any way for us to think that he's going to want to do anything different with Peter than what he did with James? No. His intention is, after the feast is over, we're going to kill Peter. You know that's got to be his intention because of the way Scripture tells us. The very context itself gives us that indication. So they put as Dr. Maynard had shown us, talked about the guards they put on him. It's kind of interesting. They put that many guards on him. Now, Peter had been in jail in chapter 5. Remember, he was released by an angel then, and they all marveled. They still don't know what happened there. Remember, the Romans go to the Sanhedrin. They don't know what happened. Peter gets out. Well, maybe Herod had heard about this. I heard some commentators talk about it. Maybe Herod had heard about this and said, Peter's not getting away this time. Peter's not going to escape me. And so he puts these squadrons on Jesus. And Dr. Maynard talked about each one is 4 soldiers as they would rotate time. So he's going to have 4 soldiers on him at all time. And we're going to find out in a passage later on, he's in the inner cell. So he's on about 3 doors. He's got 3 doors between him and the front door. And he's going to be chained probably between 2 soldiers at night with other 2 soldiers guarding the doors. So his intention is Peter's not going to get away. And there's going to be no way anybody could ever say that Peter was able to do this on his own. Paul?
It says he had James I think that's public.
That's a good point. He talks about maybe you bring him out before the people because he saw how much it pleased them with James. I'm going to really make this a big production. I mean, we could take it that way, couldn't we? Mm-hmm. I'll bring him out before the people, and we'll really get a rise out of him.
Maybe he's going to crucify him.
Yeah. So no, the Romans he probably wouldn't have done that. They would probably beheading was the thing that they would probably prefer to do, but. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? So it's a really intense time here. See if I left out anything I wanted to share with you. Now, we don't know for sure where they kept Peter. As Dr. Maynard said, here's the Fortress Antonia. This was built by Herod, and this would hold, I think it would hold up to, let's see if I got my notes here. I think it was 600 Roman soldiers. Yeah, 600 Roman soldiers were stationed here. and there is a tunnel. This is the temple. This is just how, this is a model that you can find in Jerusalem. It's actually a walking model that you can walk around if you get to personally go there and just kind of look down on the scale of what the old Jerusalem looked like. You can see the massiveness of the temple grounds. This is the sanctuary, what we'd call the sanctuary, the most holy place, the holy place, the most holy place, and the courtyards, and here's the fortress. But look how massive it is. So that's why people, when they would approach Jerusalem, they would see the temple. They would see it as they approach. It was just massive, as we can only imagine. But here's the fortress where they probably would have kept Peter under guard. And it said that they kept the high priest's garments in one of these towers because they knew the high priest was highly regarded by the people and that they didn't want him using his priestly garments to be in front of the people any more than they allowed him to. So they actually locked him down and would only let him have his royal priestly garments on feast days because they knew that was a special day. So they'd actually lock down his garments so he couldn't do anything outside of their purview. So they were really in a situation there where it looked like that was they were going to keep their tabs on that. So he's definitely appointed by the Romans to carry out these issues. So as we finish our thoughts this morning, so Peter was kept in the prison, verse 5, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church of God. So, yeah, how are the people of God going to respond? They can't. They're not going to storm the fortress, are they? They're not going to raise a revolt, and they're probably. What do you think their mindset is? Because what's happened? What's just happened? Well, what's just happened is one of their leaders, the Apostle James, has been killed. This is the first of the apostles who's been put to death. Now, Stephen was martyred, but he wasn't an apostle. Here's one of their real leaders of the church. First one has been martyred and put to death. And so you can imagine what their mindset is, that Peter now has been arrested. So what do you think they expect or in their minds are going to be about Peter, Steve?
The same thing.
Yeah, very much so. That's what they were expecting, weren't they? So you can imagine their mindset. Mike, you have a comment?
Same thing Steve said. That's amazing that people pray for God to do stuff.
And what a great example for us, because look at the obstacles. Yeah, good point, Mike. Yeah. Obstacles to fervent prayer. I mean, even for us, the disappointment. I mean, we don't know how long James was in prison. You think they prayed for James? I'm sure. We don't know. They think that his arrest and putting to death might have been more hasty. They did it before the feast. Whatever the timing is, we really don't know, but that's just what some scholars speculate and all. Yes, ma'am. You know, I think their curiosity was kind of like it is with us today. I think they would get a crowd, obviously, to witness an execution. When you think about their mindset in the Roman Colosseum, they loved the blood sports. So I think their attitude was, yeah, hey, we'll go watch this. Whether they agreed with it or not, it was just the mindset. We see that with people, but the Roman people, and we see the history of the Colosseum, they loved those blood sports, the gladiators, and throwing the Christians as we'll see later on, this persecution wraps up where they put the Christians in the arena with the lions, and those things really happen. And people, they would crowd them in. They say they would pack those arenas. So, good question. Randy? It was in Jerusalem. Yeah. That's a great point. I'm sure they're cheering it on. You know, they'd been able to kill Stephen. Now they've got a Roman authority who's gotten involved now. And maybe they felt like we finally got Rome's attention, maybe, And so no doubt they're cheering it on as Herod saw how it pleased the people. But think about the disappointment of seeing that James is killed. And like I said, we just assume, we know they must have been praying for James and the disappointment. And now, Peter's killed. And you think about that in our own prayer lives. I mean, we pray with a lot of disappointments in our lives sometimes. There's a lot of things that's happened to us we don't understand. And it can be a obstacle to our prayers because disappointments we've had. But the example we see here, we see the church knew that the only place we can go is to God. We have to get past what's happened and not forget God. We need God. And their discouragement, no doubt, not only their disappointment, but their discouragement. The church had received one blow after another. One apostle had been killed, another was in prison. The strength of the Roman forces seemed to be arrayed against them as they've got Peter in this prison with the Roman guards. Situations seemed impossible, but they prayed, and they prayed fervently. Greg?
Our prayer is because what we is always God.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's helped me deal with things that I've prayed about. We just understand that this is God's will and He's got a better plan. Some things you don't see for 10, 15 years down the road, you look back, you're like, I mean, it'll hit you like come prayer. It's like, wow, God actually answered that prayer. Wasn't the way I wanted it, but it all actually worked out for the better.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we just have to be patient and understand that even in the situation like that, even when they were praying for James, even though it didn't work out the way they wanted it, I'm sure some of them later on down the road come to understand why this had to happen.
Yeah. Great description,
I mean,
Greg.
so how many of them?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. That had to happen, yeah. Very well said, Greg. Thanks. You said it better than I could. That's exactly right. That's a great attitude to have. We're all growing in our faith. So, but great example here. So next week, let me share pages with you. Next week, read the rest of the chapter. A lot's going to happen. We're going to see Peter. You probably know the story. He's going to be freed. We're going to see Herod die. So we've got a lot that's going to go on in the rest of the chapter 12. If you're reading along with our commentaries, it's pages 449 to 469. And so we'll look at Acts 12, verses 5 through 25. Thanks for all your good comments this morning. Page numbers 449 to 469.